Hi, welcome to today's video. As you can tell by the title, the God of Life has won the poll, and we'll be talking about Kyrs today. Two disclaimers before I get into it. I am starting digital art, and I am starting that journey into art. So, as of right now, I have no official art to give you. I will be putting a pic crew, and the link will be in the description, but as that is my art, I will not be, I hope as time goes on, I will be not completely relying on that. And once I have satisfactory depictions of like the animals and the plants I'll be referring to in this video, I'll be posting that on my Instagram. I'll also be making a sketch of the inner lands that'll also be posted on my Instagram and depicted in the next video, but it is not in this video because I didn't want to give you something that was made in 5 minutes. So with that out of the way, let's get into it. We'll be covering 7 main points, and I'll be referring to my phone a lot, so forgive any pauses as I scroll. It'll be basic information, location, background, lasting effect, sacred items, offerings, and temple description. So, I don't know if it was picked up right, but Xilin, which is Kyrs' name, is the first depiction of a character that uses neopronouns. And the reason why Kyrs only uses one set pronoun is that during ancient times, gender was a lot more fluid, and so were the pronouns used during that time. It was almost equivalent to a title in a sense, and so the pronouns given to a person of high standing that weren't used in more binary terms means you were of higher standing. There's also those who were on a lower hierarchy that also used neopronouns or gender neutral pronouns because they weren't either female or male. That wasn't something that was discriminated against, just that the higher standing you were, the more likely you were to use neopronouns, because pronouns don't always equate gender. For Xilin, Ki uses Ki, Kyrs, and Kyrself. I'll be listing the equivalent to the gender neutral pronoun of they, them here for any understanding, and probably leaving it for most of the video because I myself might slip up. So back to their name, back to Kyrs' name. Xilin comes from ancient Kormgari, from the words she and lino. She meaning free, and lino meaning breath. The way that Xilin came to be depicted was a person with short stature and blazing red skin. The ears were floppy, like the animal Ki gave to them as a sign of good faith. Two multicolored eyes, one to depict freedom, and the other to depict the ending of said freedom, because they equivalated freedom to be of their life. You only had one life, and in this life you were free. Once your life ended, you will be in the hands of whatever was next. Something they did not know at the time. Xilin also was depicted with long orange hair, as Xilin worked very closely with the god of the sun. So whenever they looked at the suns, because there were multiple, and they saw orange, so they thought it was just the sun being absorbed into Kyrs' hair. He also had kind of a crown made from the plants Ophes? Yes, Ophes, which is another sacred item of Kyrs. Kyrs' domain is, of course, life. And unlike other gods, this is Kyrs' only domain. This is because they are part of the Council of Ancients. The Council of Ancients, in particular, it's a group of 10 gods that were there since the beginning of time. They are linked to every bit of the earth and are called the Council of Ancients because they're worshipped by the ancient civilizations. They aren't particularly more powerful than the other gods. They just, in their own words, have more wisdom. I can go into depth of more into the Council of Ancients if you're interested in another video. But all you need to understand right now is that the Council of Ancients only have one domain, because that is what they were, because that was the energy they fed off of to be created at the time before civilizations developed more and therefore created more smaller gods. As for the location, Xilin comes from Skur. I reference Skur in particular because Skur was the first civilization to create a monument to Xilin and start a practice of worship. So location will always refer to place of origin, basically. Skur is a small group, is a very small civilization that officially took residence in the Dayton mountain range. And this is connected, and that'll be explained a bit more later in the video in the background. But let me give you a rundown of some key points you should know about Skur. That's how you pronounce it. It's a central place, the mountain range that basically cuts through the middle of the map in just a small place. It's not the entire continent. It's just the center part is a high mountain range called the Dayton Mountain Range. It has, in the beginning, it had like no fertile land, didn't rain a lot, and it wasn't really a sustainable place. No animals were able to get up there because it was so isolated and really hard to climb. And because it's so isolated, you also had trouble trading without the proper technology. It's also high altitude, so those who didn't develop the proper lungs for it would find it very hard to survive, as altitude sickness is a thing. So, from there, we go into why the ancient Skurians came to such a place that had no real future. Well, in the base of the mountain, there is a big lake. a lake that I have not named. And in the coming weeks, they thought the lake was going to flood because they saw that the water was slowly rising, and the water was on the top of like they're like, it's like at the top of this hill, and they were towards the base of it. So the ancient Scironians were part of a bigger civilization once that split off and had two different ideas. The Scironians thought, hey, better safe than sorry, let's go up into the mountains. The other half was like, we can go to the east and find a path that is out of the way of the waters. The ones who stayed at the base are going to be told, or we're going to get into in the video for the god of the sun. Both had the right idea, just different executions. So the ancient Scironians wandered up the mountain, and they did escape the coming flood. But it was so isolated in such a rocky terrain that there was no real safe route to get back down. And only things they packed with them was a month worth of water and some herbs that will help them with the altitude. And naturally, they panicked. There was a bit of panic and a frenzy, like, oh no, we just trapped ourselves up here. So they did the only thing they really knew. At this time, there was no real connection to the gods yet, but there were signs that they still exist, that something out there existed. So they would go and start at dusk a prayer of just a plea of, if there's someone out there, can you please help us? Can you send something to show that you're out there to help us through this? And Xilin heard and answered. Kyrs' answer was to send a single dunton. And a dunton, in words that we would understand, is a goat kind of creature. A goat with some soft brown fur, about the size of a small boulder, and sharp thorns that head to the north, that point north, or point north. No, north is always one direction. Point up. I know directions. And on these thorns, wrapped around it, is vines, flourishing vines that always bear a single fruit. Have I named the fruit? No. I need to learn to name things. Wait. Make sure I didn't name it. No, I did not. But this fruit was found to be sustainable. If they mixed it with their water or mixed it with their herbs, they found that they could last a single fruit, the size of your palm, really, for about a week for their group of, I think it was like 50 people headed up into the mountain. No, not 50 people. That doesn't. So it was originally a civilization of 2,000. They split up half each. Not perfect half. So it's more not 50, 500. 500 people headed up the mountain. So a single fruit, when mixed in with an herb or water, could sustain 500 people for that week. A lot of nutritions and could be spread safely. So, these vines produced 15, 20, 10, 15 fruits per month. And the Skorians noticed this and started a prayer every month to the energy. At the time, they thought it was like the energy, and that gifted them this. Xilin's response was to gift them back some Duntons. And as time went on, added in other resources they would need to sustain themselves, like wood for fire, flint, other materials for housing. And the Skorians soon found themselves to be able to thrive in this environment. So, and that's how Xilin came to contact with the inner lands. But the pantheon grew and became very prominent. So while Xilin didn't continue to be a prominent god that was worshipped, Xilin still had lasting effects. And these are these lasting effects. Time, centuries, technology grew with the items that Xilin was able to gift them. And through that, Skur was able to isolate themselves, particularly when they found themselves minerals, and was able to combine that in their heat source to basically create a vehicle to safely come down the mountain and establish a trading route with those who stayed at the base of the mountain during the flooding. There is still the temple that is still sometimes visited and maintained by priests, and of course the pockets of those who still prominent Xilin. Xilin, like most ancients, visits this temple regularly to just for like the sense of nostalgia, because that was Kyrs' time of prime and their first time touching this world. Particularly the friend that they like to travel with is the sun god, and they both just travel back and forth through the mountain, making sure things still run smoothly. But Skur did move on and created particularly the trading god, which, if you track the origins, does lead back to Xilin. And Skur also created the god of, or had a hand in, didn't have a hand in. They created the god of minerals, particularly, but the god of minerals doesn't exactly have a path back to Xilin. That's more to a different god that I need to track, but it's not Xilin. There's also the god of harvest, but the god of harvest also made their debut back in a sailor town. So, not here in Skur. But even if Xilin isn't worshipped as much by Skur or other civilizations, because the worship and the word did flow with the winds and got out to other civilizations, and they made their own worships. Key is content with Kyrs' job and feels as if it's complete. And so Key just continues Kyrs' travels with the sun god. And sometimes he returns back to the Upperlands to see what they're doing. So, now that we have some background and what became of Xilin, let's talk about the sacred items and the offerings that the ancient Skurians offered to Kyrs. We first have on our list the Dutun, that of course I've explained. It's the goat creature with natural vines growing to the horns, fruits that can sustain if mixed in with the right ingredients. It has a lot of earth tones in its fur, but particularly bright red eyes. It also has very floppy ears, like Xilin, and that's where the floppy ears came in Xilin's design. Kyrs' sacred color is red, so a lot of clothing that was worn for offerings depicted some red, and a lot of things created in Xilin's name had red on it. And it's also in Skurs crest. Steel is also another sacred item. It's the most prominent mineral. I think steel's a metal, but they kind of lumped it with minerals. So steel is the thing that is like their most prominent resource, and so they took steel and gave it as offerings for when they needed more like tool items that they couldn't quite create themselves, and they needed a bit of guidance. Then there's the Ofes, which I mentioned before. It is actually the blossoms that the fruits are created from on the Dutun's horns. It's a lot of priests take these blossoms and burn them in offerings to Xilin in hopes that he gives them a good bountiful year in food and other needed resources. And finally, there's a season that is connected to Xilin. And seasons are connected to a lot of gods. Particularly for Xilin, Kyrs' season is Raincress. And this is a season that they carved out a time of year where there will be some prominent rainfall, and therefore they will always have a full supply of water. So during this time, those who resided in Skur was able to replenish their water and don't go dehydrated throughout the year. And because they're in the mountain range, they're able to carve out like selected places so their area wouldn't flood and kind of just drain down the mountain, and actually created a waterfall, a prominent waterfall that is there today. But yeah, this season was dedicated to Xilin, and a lot of high priests, or just priests in general, made sure that everything was ready for this season, as this will be the sign that they will have a bountiful year, and will be usually when they get their items. So, now that we know the sacred items, and links towards the offerings, let's tell you about the 3 offerings Xilin usually gets. We have Ofes, of course. Like I said before, Ofes is the blooms, and it's usually burned. But other times, it's eaten, as the blossoms are edible. And this is in times of great need. And so if a blossom is eaten, Xilin may take pity and give some items early before the rain crest. Then there are the prayers from the book of Luno. Luno means life. And Kormgari. And these prayers are just your daily prayers and your sign of worship. And each prayer in the book has a different use. Some are for food, other are for tools, others are for sickness, and each have a specific use. So each person who wanted an aspect of their life to improve would select this prayer and dedicate the hour to repeating this prayer in hopes that Xilin would hear and answer in a way for them to achieve improvement in that aspect. And lastly, there's Raincrest Mead. And it was a drink used in ceremonies and annual ceremonies to say thanks after a great year. It's a drink made from the rainfall from the raincrest season, and some herb and the altitude herbs that they brought with them. And this is, of course, like I said, a sign of thanks, and also a sign of remembrance of how they came here. So now that we've talked about the offerings, we can finally tell about the temple. The temple was a small building because they didn't have a lot of room, nor did they had a lot of resources in creating it. There's no roof, and it's located on the tallest peak that they had access to. And the reason why they put no roof was because they wanted to let the rain fall in. And so it'll be easier to catch in this building, and sometimes it would flood a bit. But it never got to the point where it was disastrous. So the floors would have like a layer of water, and they would put bowls, cups, sometimes jugs to catch that water on the floor. But the walls stood high. It's as if it's like a box, and the walls ended in kind of a spikes kind of way, kind of like how you think of mountain peaks, or how a child would draw the peaks of mountains. There were open spaces in the walls, but no glass windows because, well, they had no sand there. That was until, one asked for sand for some art of glass blowing they heard on their travels, but Xilin wasn't the one to answer that call. The walls are made of stone, naturally, and the stone was smooth. It took many years to smooth out the stone, A lot of it was from the rain beating down on it, but a lot of it was hand smoothed. A lot of hard work. And when this temple was in its prime, it was painted the same bright red that was Xilin's skin. But with years, the paint has faded and it's not as pigmentally prominent. You can still see that the walls are red, but it's more of a faded red, and you can start seeing the natural grays in the stone. Inside, the walls are lined with images of Xilin's sacred items, and there's even a wall with a whole body painting of Xilin, Kyrself. Also inside are, as I said, bowls to catch the rainwater. And there's also a stone altar. On the stone altar is the Book of Luno, which was put in a chest for safekeeping once they were done with their daily prayers. The chest itself was also made out of stone, so they could protect it from outside and weather, outside conditions, so it wouldn't get completely destroyed. But time came for it, so the pages are a bit worn from use, but the Book of Luno is still very readable because Xilin, of course, is connected to this book, and so a part of Kyrs' energy is inside this book, which is why it's not completely destroyed after so many centuries. Also on the altar is an ofes that is put into a jar so they could always remember the first ever offering they ever got. And there's some steel bars ready for any weaponsmith or blacksmith offering that they needed back in the days. Also inside, and lastly, what was also inside were stone slabs, kind of like this big, that you kind of could either kneel on or put your elbows on for whenever you needed to rest during long prayer sessions. Wasn't the most comfortable, but eventually they put some leaves and some dried grass to make it a bit more cushioned. There was also they also eventually upgraded to some fur of a Duntun that passed on. So, and that fur was very soft, so whatever was left over from making beds were put onto these slabs, so it could make kneeling and sitting on a bit more bearable. Well, that is the end of the temple description. Can't wait to figure out how to draw that. And I hope you enjoy the video. And I hope you are excited to see what else I have in store. Because this is the structure that I'm thinking for. Just different 7 main segments going into the history of each god and a bit into their location. I can do a deeper dive on Skewer if needed, going into the development and the development of culture and their language and how being stuck in the mountains affected their view on the world and their connection and their work with other gods that weren't personally created by them. But that's all for next time. And we've reached the end of this one. And I hope you have an amazing day. And I'll see you all in the next one. See ya!